Captain James Riley checked his watch as he walked across the humid tarmac at Bien Hoa Air Base. It was 4:30 in the morning on June 14, 1967, and the sun hadn't yet broken over the horizon. The air was thick and heavy, already warm despite the early hour. Riley was headed toward his aircraft, a Fairchild C-123 Provider cargo plane that had been modified in ways that made it unlike any other aircraft in the United States Air Force inventory. The C-123 sat on the runway, its twin engines silent, its distinctive high wing and bulbous fuselage giving it an almost ungainly appearance. But what made this particular provider different from the cargo haulers it had been designed to be was the equipment mounted underneath. A 1,000-gallon spray tank system ran the length of the aircraft's belly, with spray booms extending from the wings and tail. This wasn't a cargo plane anymore. It was a weapon. And its ammunition was a chemical herbicide mixture that the military had designated Agent Orange. Riley was a ranch hand pilot. That was the code name for Operation Ranch Hand, the massive defoliation program that the United States military had been conducting over South Vietnam since 1962. The mission was simple in concept: spray herbicides over the jungle canopy to deny the Viet Cong cover and concealment, destroy their food crops, and clear vegetation along roads and waterways to prevent ambushes. In practice, the mission was far more complex and far more dangerous than anyone had initially anticipated. As Riley approached his aircraft, he could smell it. That distinctive chemical odor that clung to every ranch hand plane, that permeated the flight suits and gear of every crew member, that seemed to work its way into your skin and hair no matter how many times you showered. It was the smell of the herbicides they sprayed, a mix of 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T in diesel fuel or kerosene, along with various other chemical agents depending on what was loaded that day. The ground crew was already at work, filling the spray tanks from large storage drums. They wore minimal protective equipment, just standard fatigues and work gloves. No one had told them that what they were handling might be dangerous to their health. The military's official position was that these herbicides were safe, no more harmful than common agricultural chemicals used on farms across America. The ground crew joked and talked as they worked, occasionally wiping sweat from their faces with hands that had just been handling chemical-soaked equipment. Riley's crew was gathering near the aircraft. His co-pilot, First Lieutenant Michael Chen, was reviewing the mission briefing documents under the wing. The flight engineer, Technical Sergeant Robert Martinez, was conducting his pre-flight inspection, checking the spray system components along with the standard aircraft systems. And the spray operator, Staff Sergeant William Thompson, was examining the spray control panel that had been installed in the cargo area of the aircraft. The ranch hand crews were volunteers, though not everyone fully understood what they were volunteering for when they first signed up. The Air Force had put out a call for experienced C-123 pilots and crew members for a special mission in Vietnam. The job came with some perks: better pay, more freedom than regular cargo operations, and the promise of flying a unique mission that was supposedly critical to winning the war. Many crews had volunteered thinking it would be an interesting change from routine cargo hauling. Few had understood they would be flying into hostile fire while spraying chemicals over the Vietnamese jungle day after day, month after month. Riley gathered his crew for the mission brief. They huddled under the wing of the provider as the eastern sky began to lighten with the approaching dawn. Riley spread out the tactical map, showing their target area for today's mission. It was a section of jungle about 40 miles northwest of Saigon, an area that intelligence believed was being used by the Viet Cong as an infiltration route. The mission was to spray a corridor approximately 2 miles long and 500 feet wide, destroying the jungle canopy and denying the enemy cover. The flight profile was standard for ranch hand operations. They would take off before sunrise and fly low level to the target area, staying below 500 feet to avoid radar detection for as long as possible. Once they reached the target, they would descend to just 150 feet above the jungle canopy and begin their spray run. At that altitude, flying at 130 knots, the spray system would release the herbicide in a fine mist that would settle over the vegetation below. The aircraft would make multiple parallel passes over the target area until the entire zone had been covered and the spray tanks were empty. The danger came from the altitude. At 150 feet above the jungle, flying in a straight line at a constant speed, the ranch hand aircraft were sitting ducks for enemy ground fire. The Viet Cong had learned to anticipate ranch hand missions and had positioned anti-aircraft weapons along likely spray routes. They would wait until the aircraft were in the middle of their spray runs, when the planes were most vulnerable, and then open fire with everything they had. Heavy machine guns, small arms, sometimes even larger anti-aircraft artillery, if they had managed to move it into position. The ranch hand aircraft had been modified to survive this hostile environment. Armor plating had been installed on the underside of the fuselage and around the cockpit area. The spray tanks were self-sealing, designed to minimize leakage if punctured by ground fire. Extra equipment had been stripped out to reduce weight and improve performance. And the aircraft had been painted with distinctive markings. 3 horizontal, stripes, purple, orange, and white, that ran around the rear fuselage. These stripes were supposed to identify ranch hand aircraft to friendly forces, but they also made the planes instantly recognizable to the enemy. The crews had adopted an unofficial motto that captured the dark humor of their situation. Only you can prevent forests. It was a twisted play on the Smokey the Bear fire prevention slogan, and it reflected the gallows humor that helped the crews cope with the danger and the moral ambiguity of what they were doing. They were destroying forests, not preventing fires. They were spraying chemicals over a country, and while the military told them it was necessary and safe, some crews were beginning to have doubts. Riley finished the mission brief, and the crew headed to the aircraft for the final pre-flight checks. Martinez completed his walk-around inspection, checking control surfaces, landing gear, engines, and the spray system components. Everything looked good. Thompson powered up the spray control panel and ran through the system checks, verifying that all the spray nozzles were functioning and that the flow rates were calibrated correctly. Chen reviewed the navigation plan and verified the radio frequencies they would use for the mission. At 5:15, with the sky now showing the first pink and orange streaks of dawn, Riley called for engine start. The 2 Pratt & Whitney radial engines coughed to life, one after the other, their distinctive rumble echoing across the airfield. Black smoke puffed from the exhausts as the engines warmed up. Riley let them run for several minutes, watching the instruments, making sure all systems were operating normally. Oil pressure good, fuel flow good, hydraulics good, spray system armed and ready. At 5:25, they received clearance for takeoff. Riley advanced the throttles and the heavily loaded provider began rolling down the runway. With a full load of herbicide in the spray tanks, the aircraft was near its maximum takeoff weight. The acceleration was sluggish, and it took most of the runway length before Riley felt the nose wheel lift off. A few seconds later, the main gear left the ground, and they were airborne. Riley kept the aircraft low as they departed Bien Hoa, climbing to only 300 feet before leveling off and turning northwest toward the target area. This low-level flight was standard procedure for ranch hand missions. It kept them under most radar coverage and made them harder to see and track from the ground. But it also meant they were flying through the hazardous layer of air where birds, towers, and terrain were constant threats. The crew had to maintain intense concentration, watching for obstacles while also watching for enemy fire. The flight to the target area took about 30 minutes. Riley flew using visual navigation, following roads and rivers and landmarks that he had memorized from previous missions in this area. Chen monitored the instruments and helped watch for obstacles. Martinez stood between the pilot's seats, also watching ahead and calling out anything he spotted. Thompson waited in the cargo area, ready to activate the spray system when they reached the target. As they flew over the Vietnamese countryside in the early morning light, Riley could see the patchwork of rice paddies, villages, and jungle below. Thin columns of smoke rose from cooking fires in the villages. Water buffalo grazed in the paddies. It looked peaceful from the air, but Riley knew that appearance was deceptive. This was a war zone, and anywhere they flew could suddenly erupt with hostile fire. At 5:55, they reached the initial point for their spray run. Riley could see the target area ahead, a stretch of dense jungle along a river valley. The jungle looked impenetrable from the air, a solid carpet of green stretching in all directions. Intelligence said the Viet Cong were using trails through that jungle to move supplies and personnel. Ranch Hand's job was to strip away that green carpet and expose those trails. Riley descended to 150 feet above the jungle canopy. At this altitude, he could see individual trees, could see the texture of the jungle surface, could occasionally glimpse openings where clearings or waterways broke through the canopy. The aircraft was now in extreme danger from ground fire. Every member of the crew was tense, hyper alert, waiting for the first indication that they were being shot at. At precisely 600 hours, Riley called "spray on." Thompson activated the spray system. The pumps engaged with a whine that could be heard throughout the aircraft. The spray nozzles opened and began releasing herbicide in a fine mist. Behind the aircraft, a cloud of chemical spray trailed away, drifting down onto the jungle canopy below. They were committed now. They had to maintain this altitude, this heading, and this speed for the entire length of the spray run. Any deviation would leave gaps in coverage and mean they would have to make additional passes to complete the mission. The provider droned along at 150 feet, engines roaring at high power to maintain airspeed, spray system pumping out herbicide at approximately 3 gallons per acre. Riley held the controls steady, making only small corrections to maintain the precise flight path. Chen called out airspeed and altitude. Martinez watched the engines and systems. Thompson monitored the spray system and watched for any signs of malfunction or leaks. They were 2 minutes into the spray run when the first tracers arced up from the jungle. Green and red dots of light rising from the green canopy, appearing deceptively slow at first, but actually traveling at hundreds of feet per second. The Viet Cong were shooting at them with automatic weapons, probably 12.7mm heavy machine guns, based on the size of the tracers. Riley's instinct was to jink, to bank the aircraft and break away from the incoming fire, but he couldn't, not while spraying. Breaking off the spray run would waste the herbicide, and they would have to come back and do it again, facing the same fire. So he held the aircraft steady and kept flying straight toward the enemy guns, watching the tracers arc past the cockpit, some passing so close he could have sworn he felt the heat. Martinez called out, "Taking hits," as they heard and felt the impacts of bullets striking the aircraft. The distinctive whang of metal hitting metal, the sudden appearance of holes in the aluminum skin. Most of the rounds were hitting the underside of the aircraft, where the armor plating was thickest. But some were finding gaps in the armor, punching through into the aircraft structure, into systems, into areas where the crew was located. Chen suddenly grunted and grabbed his left arm. Blood began seeping between his fingers. A round had come through the side window, or the cockpit wall, and had struck him in the forearm. But he didn't cry out, didn't panic. He kept his right hand on the throttles and his eyes on the instruments, doing his job even while wounded. Riley glanced over, saw the blood, and made a split-second decision. They would complete this spray run. Breaking off now would mean they had taken fire, and Chen had been wounded for nothing. The aircraft shuddered as more rounds impacted. Warning lights illuminated on the panel. The right engine oil pressure was dropping. They had taken hits in the engine or the oil lines. Riley watched the gauge carefully. If the oil pressure dropped too far, they would lose that engine. Flying on one engine with a full spray tank would be marginal at best, potentially impossible if they had taken other damage that affected the aircraft's aerodynamic performance. They were 4 minutes into the spray run, more than halfway through, when the hydraulic system warning light came on. They had lost hydraulic fluid, probably from a severed line. The flight controls became heavier, harder to move. Riley had to use both hands on the yoke and apply significant force to keep the aircraft straight and level. His arms were already aching from the effort, and they still had another 3 minutes of spraying to complete. Thompson called from the cargo area. "Spray system hit. I'm showing reduced flow on the starboard wing section." One or more of the spray nozzles on the right wing had been damaged by ground fire and wasn't releasing herbicide properly. This meant the coverage would be uneven, with a gap on the right side of the spray path. They would definitely have to make a second pass to fill in that gap, which meant flying through this same ground fire again. Riley gritted his teeth and held the aircraft steady. The tracers kept coming up from the jungle, a continuous stream now as the Viet Cong realized they had hit the aircraft and were trying to finish it off. More impacts, more warning lights. The aircraft was being chewed up by enemy fire, but it was still flying, still spraying, still accomplishing the mission. At 6:07, they reached the end of the target area. Riley called, "Spray off." Thompson shut down the spray system. Riley immediately banked the aircraft hard left and began a climbing turn to get away from the ground fire. As soon as they were out of the Viet Cong gunner's line of sight, the tracers stopped. The sudden absence of incoming fire was almost shocking after the intensity of the past 7 minutes. Riley leveled off at 1,000 feet and assessed the damage. The right engine oil pressure was still dropping, but hadn't failed completely yet. The hydraulic system was degraded, but still functioning, though the controls were heavy and sluggish. They had holes throughout the aircraft structure, and Chen was wounded and losing blood. Chen had already applied pressure to his wound with his right hand while keeping his left hand on the throttles. Martinez grabbed the first aid kit and helped Chen wrap a pressure bandage around his forearm. The wound was bleeding steadily, but didn't appear to have hit an artery. Chen insisted he could keep flying. They needed to make another spray pass to complete the mission, and he wasn't going to quit before the job was done. Riley made the decision to complete the mission. They still had herbicide in the spray tanks. They had been shot up, and Chen had been wounded. If they didn't finish the job now, another ranch hand crew would have to come back tomorrow and face the same ground fire to spray the same target. Better to finish it now, while the enemy gunners were still in position and before they could reinforce or relocate. He brought the aircraft around in a wide circle, giving the crew time to prepare for another spray run. Martinez checked all the systems again. The right engine was still running, but the oil pressure continued to drop slowly. They probably had 15 to 20 minutes before that engine would seize. The hydraulic system was maintaining pressure for now, but was definitely leaking. The spray system had damage to the starboard wing section, but the rest of the nozzles were still functional. Thompson reported they had enough herbicide remaining for one more pass, maybe slightly shorter than the first run, but enough to cover the gap where the damaged nozzles had failed to spray. Riley calculated the run timing. They needed about 6 minutes over the target to complete the coverage. That should be within the limits of the damaged aircraft's capabilities. Probably. At 6:15, they rolled in on the second spray run. Riley descended back to 150 feet above the jungle canopy and lined up on the same spray path, offset slightly to the right to compensate for the damaged nozzles. At 6:16, he called "spray on" again. Thompson activated the spray system, and once more the herbicide began flowing from the nozzles, trailing behind the aircraft in a toxic mist. The Viet Cong were ready this time. They knew the aircraft would be coming back. The tracers started immediately, denser than before. The enemy had repositioned additional weapons to cover the spray path. The provider flew into a storm of ground fire. The sound of impacts was almost continuous, a rattling drumbeat of bullets hitting aluminum. Riley held the aircraft steady. He had no choice. Chen, wounded and in pain, kept his hands on the controls and his eyes on the instruments, calling out altitude and airspeed. Martinez watched the failing systems, ready to call out if anything became critical. Thompson monitored the spray flow, ensuring maximum coverage on this final pass. The right engine oil pressure finally hit 0. The engine seized with a loud bang and a shudder that ran through the entire airframe. Riley immediately compensated, adding power on the left engine and applying rudder to counter the asymmetric thrust. The aircraft slewed slightly to the right before he got it back under control. Now they were flying on one engine, at 150 feet altitude, with a heavy load of herbicide still in the tanks, taking continuous ground fire, with degraded hydraulics and a wounded co-pilot. But they were also only 2 minutes from the end of the spray run. Riley made the calculation. 2 minutes. They could stay airborne on one engine for 2 minutes. They could maintain altitude. They could complete the mission. He held the aircraft steady and kept flying into the enemy fire. More impacts. More holes in the aircraft. A round came through the cockpit and shattered the instrument panel directly between Riley and Chen, showering them with glass and plastic fragments. Another round punched through the cargo area floor, right next to where Thompson was standing, missing him by inches. The aircraft was being systematically destroyed around them, but it was still flying. At 6:22, they reached the end of the target area. Riley called "spray off," and Thompson shut down the system. Riley immediately banked away from the ground fire and began climbing on the one remaining engine. The aircraft struggled to gain altitude with the heavy drag from the dead engine and the depleted but still partially full spray tanks. They climbed slowly, painfully, foot by foot, away from the jungle and away from the enemy guns. At 6:25, they were at 2,000 feet and clear of immediate danger. Riley assessed their situation. They had one engine out. They had degraded hydraulics. They had a wounded co-pilot. They had dozens, maybe hundreds of holes in the aircraft structure, but they were flying. And they had completed their mission. The target area had been sprayed with herbicide. In a few days, The jungle canopy in that area would begin to wither and die, stripping away the cover the Viet Cong had been using. The flight back to Bien Hoa took 45 minutes on one engine. Riley nursed the crippled provider through the morning, Sky maintaining just enough altitude to glide to the base if the remaining engine failed. Chen sat beside him, pale from blood loss, but still helping to fly the aircraft. Martinez stood behind them, monitoring the systems, ready to deal with any further emergencies. Thompson secured the spray system and checked the cargo area for damage, finding dozens of bullet holes but no structural failures that would prevent them from landing. As they approached Bien Hoa, Riley called the tower and declared an emergency. He requested medical assistance standing by for Chen and a full emergency response for the damaged aircraft. The tower cleared them for a straight-in approach to the runway, moving all other traffic out of the way. The landing was challenging with the degraded hydraulics and the asymmetric power from having only one engine. Riley had to use heavy control inputs and careful power management to keep the aircraft aligned with the runway. The touchdown was firm but controlled. As soon as the wheels touched down, Riley pulled the remaining engine to idle and applied brakes. The provider rolled out and came to a stop halfway down the runway. Emergency vehicles swarmed the aircraft immediately. Medics rushed aboard and began treating Chen, preparing him for transport to the base hospital. Maintenance crews examined the damage, counting the bullet holes, assessing the system's failures. The aircraft had taken over 40 hits, including multiple strikes to both engines, the hydraulic system, the spray system, and the flight control surfaces. That it had stayed airborne long enough to complete the mission and return to base was remarkable. Riley shut down the remaining engine and sat in the cockpit for a long moment, his hands shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off. He had just flown through intense enemy fire twice, had lost an engine, had brought back a shot-up aircraft and a wounded crew member. It was 6:45 in the morning. The sun was fully up now, bright and hot. He had been awake for barely 2 hours, and he had already faced more danger and stress than most people experience in a lifetime. This was the reality of life aboard the Ranch Hand C-123 providers. This was what the crews faced every time they took off on a spray mission: intense ground fire, damaged aircraft, wounded or killed crew members, flying crippled planes back to base. And then, after the aircraft was patched up and the replacement crew members were assigned, going out and doing it all over again the next day. Day after day, week after week, month after month, until their tour was complete, or until they were too badly wounded to fly, or until they were killed. And through all of this, the herbicides kept spraying. The chemicals kept flowing from the tanks, through the nozzles, into the air, onto the jungle, onto the villages, onto the people below, and onto the crews themselves. Because the wind would blow the spray back over the aircraft. Because the spray would get into the cockpit through vents and bullet holes. Because crew members would breathe it, would get it on their skin, would absorb it into their bodies, mission after mission, exposure after exposure, building up in their systems in ways they didn't understand and couldn't prevent. Captain James Riley didn't know it yet on that June morning in 1967. But the herbicides he had been spraying for months would eventually kill him. Not quickly like a bullet or a crash, but slowly, over decades, as the chemicals caused cancers and other diseases that would ultimately take his life. The same chemicals would sicken or kill many of his fellow Ranch Hand crew members. The very mission they were risking their lives to accomplish was poisoning them. But that knowledge was still years in the future. On that morning at Bien Hoa, Riley was just focused on the immediate realities. His co-pilot was wounded, but would survive. His aircraft was shot up, but would be repaired. And he had completed his mission. The jungle had been sprayed. That was what mattered. That was what the Air Force cared about. The long-term consequences of the chemicals they were spraying? Nobody was thinking about that. Not yet. Operation Ranch Hand officially began on January 12, 1962, though preliminary testing and planning had been going on for months before that. The concept was born out of frustration with the tactical situation in South Vietnam. The Viet Cong were masters of guerrilla warfare, using the dense jungle as cover for their movements, their base camps, and their attacks. American and South Vietnamese forces had superior firepower and numbers, but they couldn't engage an enemy they couldn't see and couldn't find in the impenetrable jungle. The solution, proposed by military planners and embraced by senior leadership, was to remove the jungle itself. If the Viet Cong were using the jungle for cover, eliminate the cover. Spray herbicides to defoliate the trees, exposing the enemy to observation and attack. Destroy crops to deny the Viet Cong food supplies. Clear vegetation along roads and waterways to prevent ambushes. The herbicides would be like a massive pruning of the Vietnamese landscape, shaping the terrain to favor American tactical advantages. The operation was given the codename Ranch Hand, reportedly chosen at random from a list of available code words, though some Air Force personnel joked that it was appropriate given they were essentially crop dusting the Vietnamese jungle. The motto chosen for the operation was, "Only we can prevent forests," a dark play on the Smokey the Bear slogan that would later be adopted informally by the crews who flew the missions. The aircraft chosen for Ranch Hand operations was the Fairchild C-123 Provider, a twin-engine cargo plane that had entered service with the Air Force in the mid-1950s. The Provider was a rugged, reliable aircraft designed for short takeoff and landing operations from austere airfields. It could carry substantial loads and had good low-speed handling characteristics. These features made it ideal for conversion to a spray aircraft. The modifications to convert Providers for Ranch Hand operations were extensive and sophisticated. The primary addition was the spray system itself, a marvel of engineering that transformed a cargo aircraft into an effective herbicide dispersal platform. The system consisted of several key components, all carefully designed to maximize spray coverage while minimizing the aircraft's vulnerability during spray operations. The heart of the system was the spray tank installation. A 1,000-gallon tank was mounted internally in the cargo area of the aircraft. This tank was reinforced and designed with self-sealing capabilities similar to military fuel tanks. If the tank was punctured by ground fire, which happened frequently, rubber liners would swell on contact with the herbicide and seal small holes, minimizing leakage. The tank included baffles to prevent the liquid from sloshing excessively during flight maneuvers, which could affect the aircraft's stability and control. From the main tank, a pressurized pumping system moved the herbicide to the spray distribution network. The pumps had to be powerful enough to force the thick herbicide mixture through all the spray nozzles at the high flow rates required for effective coverage, but also reliable enough to function in the harsh environment of combat operations. The pump system included redundant components so that if one pump failed, others could maintain spray capability. The spray distribution network ran through the aircraft's structure to spray booms mounted on the wings and tail. The wing booms extended outward from near the wingtips, placing spray nozzles far from the aircraft's centerline to maximize the spray width. The tail boom extended from the rear of the aircraft, providing additional coverage behind the plane. These booms were designed to be aerodynamically efficient, producing minimal drag while still positioning the nozzles for optimal spray pattern. The spray nozzles themselves were specialized components designed to atomize the herbicide into a fine mist. The size of the droplets was critical. Too large, and the spray wouldn't disperse properly or wouldn't stick to foliage. Too small, and the spray would drift excessively in the wind, potentially missing the target entirely or contaminating areas outside the target zone. The nozzles were designed to produce droplets in the optimal size range for herbicide application, roughly 100 to 400 microns in diameter. The Ranch Hand aircraft carried multiple types of nozzles that could be selected based on mission requirements and weather conditions. Standard nozzles were used for most missions. Special reduced drift nozzles were available for missions near friendly villages or populated areas, though these were rarely used in practice. High-flow nozzles could be installed for missions where maximum coverage and minimum time was the priority, accepting higher drift in exchange for reduced exposure time over the target. A spray control panel was installed in the cargo area, operated by the spray systems operator, who became a standard crew position on Ranch Hand aircraft. This panel allowed the operator to control spray flow rates, select which nozzle groups were active, monitor tank quantity, and shut down the system in emergencies. The panel included visual indicators showing spray flow from each nozzle group, allowing the operator to detect malfunctions or damage during operations. The aircraft were also modified with armor protection to improve survivability in the face of ground fire. Steel armor plating, ranging from 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch thick, was installed on the underside of the fuselage, particularly around the cockpit area and along the route where the spray system components ran through the aircraft. The spray tanks themselves provided some protection, as the liquid-filled tank would absorb and slow bullets passing through it. Additional armor was installed around the cockpit, including armored seats for the pilots and armor plating on the sides and floor of the flight deck. Small armored glass panels were installed in the cockpit windows, providing limited protection against small arms fire while still allowing visibility. These modifications added substantial weight to the aircraft, reducing its payload capacity and performance, but were deemed necessary given the intense ground fire ranch hand crews regularly encountered. The engines on ranch hand providers received special attention from maintenance crews. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engines that powered the C-123 were reliable and powerful, but they were also vulnerable to ground fire. Engine components were shielded where possible, and maintenance procedures emphasized careful inspection for damage after every mission. Ranch hand aircraft engines accumulated battle damage at rates far higher than normal cargo providers, requiring frequent component replacement and overhaul. The aircraft's fuel system was modified with self-sealing fuel tanks and redundant fuel lines. Losing fuel to combat damage was a constant risk, and the modifications were designed to minimize that risk. Even so, ranch hand aircraft frequently returned to base, trailing fuel vapor from damaged tanks, having barely made it back with enough fuel remaining to land. The electrical and hydraulic systems received similar hardening modifications. Critical components were moved to more protected locations where possible. Redundant systems were added so that damage to one component wouldn't result in complete system failure. These modifications proved their worth repeatedly, as ranch hand aircraft routinely returned from missions with multiple systems damaged, but still functional enough to get the crew home. The ranch hand aircraft were painted in a distinctive camouflage scheme that ironically made them more visible rather than less. The top surfaces were painted in standard jungle camouflage patterns of green and brown, but the bottom surfaces were painted light gray or white, which stood out starkly against the green jungle below. And most distinctively, 3 horizontal stripes were painted around the rear fuselage: purple, orange, and white from top to bottom. These stripes served as identification markings, theoretically to help friendly forces identify ranch hand aircraft and avoid shooting at them. In practice, the stripes also helped the enemy identify ranch hand aircraft, making them priority targets. The Viet Cong quickly learned to recognize the distinctive striped tail of ranch hand planes and would hold their fire on other aircraft to save ammunition for ranch hand missions. The crews joked bitterly about the stripes, calling them target markers or shoot me signs. There were suggestions to eliminate them, but Air Force leadership maintained they were necessary for coordination with friendly forces. The stripes remained throughout the operation, a distinctive and somewhat ironic badge of the ranch hand mission. The herbicides sprayed by ranch hand aircraft were designated by color-coded names based on the color of the identification stripes on the storage drums. Agent Orange, named for the orange stripe on its drums, was the most common herbicide used. It was a 50-50 mixture of 2 herbicides, 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T, mixed in diesel fuel or kerosene as a carrier. Agent Orange was highly effective at defoliating broadleaf plants and trees, causing leaves to drop within days of exposure and killing plants within weeks. Agent White and Agent Blue were other herbicides used in ranch hand operations, each with different chemical compositions and effects. Agent White used a different herbicide mixture and was considered less persistent in the environment than Agent Orange. Agent Blue was designed specifically to destroy crops, particularly rice, and worked by desiccating plants rather than causing defoliation. The choice of which herbicide to use on a given mission depended on the target type and desired effects. What none of the ranch hand crews knew at the time was that Agent Orange was contaminated with a highly toxic compound called TCDD, or dioxin. This contamination was a byproduct of the manufacturing process used to produce 2,4,5-T, one of the 2 herbicides in the Agent Orange mixture. The level of dioxin contamination varied between batches of herbicide, with some drums containing dioxin concentrations far higher than others. TCDD is one of the most toxic chemicals known to science. It causes cancer, birth defects, immune system damage, and numerous other health problems, even at extremely low exposure levels. The dioxin in Agent Orange would ultimately cause thousands of cases of cancer and other diseases in both American service members and Vietnamese civilians. But in the 1960s, this danger was unknown, or at least unacknowledged. The military's official position was that Agent Orange was safe, no more dangerous than common agricultural herbicides. The ranch hand crews received no special protective equipment for handling the herbicides. They flew in standard flight suits. They breathed cabin air that was often contaminated with herbicide vapor that entered through vents or through the numerous bullet holes that appeared in the aircraft during missions. When spray nozzles were damaged or when wind patterns were unfavorable, herbicide would blow back over the aircraft, coating the exterior and entering the cockpit. Crew members would sometimes return from missions with their flight suits soaked with herbicide, their skin tingling from exposure. Ground crews who loaded the herbicides into the aircraft spray tanks wore even less protection. They worked in the tropical heat in standard fatigues, handling the herbicide drums and operating the pumping equipment that filled the aircraft tanks. They were exposed to high concentrations of herbicide, breathing the vapors, getting it on their skin, working with it day after day. And they were told it was safe. The spray procedures used by ranch hand crews were developed through trial and error in the early months of operations, and then refined based on experience over the years. The standard profile involved low-level flight to the target area to avoid detection and reduce exposure time to enemy defenses. Once at the target, the aircraft would descend to the spray altitude, typically 150 feet above the target surface, though this varied depending on terrain and threat assessment. At spray altitude, the aircraft would fly a precise pattern, usually parallel straight lines spaced to provide overlapping coverage. The spacing between spray lines was calculated based on the aircraft's spray width, the wind speed and direction, and the type of herbicide being used. The goal was complete coverage of the target area with minimum wasted herbicide and minimum flight time over hostile territory. The spray flow rate was calibrated to deliver approximately 3 gallons of herbicide per acre, though this rate varied based on mission requirements. Higher flow rates meant faster coverage but less effective kill of vegetation. Lower flow rates meant more effective kill, but longer exposure time to enemy fire. The flow rate was adjustable during the mission, allowing the spray operator to compensate for changes in ground speed or tactical situation. Wind was a critical factor in spray operations. Too much wind would cause excessive drift, potentially carrying the herbicide miles from the intended target. Too little wind and the spray would fall straight down without dispersing properly, creating uneven coverage. The ideal conditions were light winds of 5 to 10 knots that would carry the spray across the target area without excessive drift. But missions were often flown in less than ideal conditions because tactical necessity outweighed optimal spray effectiveness. The aircraft typically carried enough herbicide for 10 to 15 minutes of continuous spraying, depending on the flow rate settings and the capacity of the particular aircraft. A single spray run might last only a few minutes, covering a mile or two of target area. The aircraft would then have to break off, turn around, and line up for another pass. Multiple passes were required to cover larger target areas, with each pass exposing the crew to enemy fire. After completing a spray mission, ranch hand crews faced the return flight to base, often in damaged aircraft, sometimes with wounded crew members. The flight back was its own kind of challenge. Damaged engines or control systems had to be nursed along. Wounded crew members had to be kept stable until medical help could reach them. Fuel leaks had to be monitored to ensure enough fuel remained to reach base. Every ranch hand crew had stories of harrowing return flights, of aircraft barely staying in the air, of wheels touching down on the runway just as engines failed or fuel ran out. Back at base, the post-mission procedures were extensive. The aircraft had to be inspected for damage. Bullet holes had to be counted, documented, and assessed for their impact on aircraft systems. Battle damage repairs had to be initiated, with priorities assigned based on mission schedules and the severity of the damage. Spray systems had to be flushed and serviced. Engines had to be checked for damage. Flight control systems had to be tested. Often, aircraft returning from missions required hours or days of maintenance before they could fly again. The crews themselves went through debriefings, providing intelligence on enemy anti-aircraft positions, spray coverage achieved, and any unusual observations from the mission. Wounded crew members were sent to the base hospital for treatment. The rest of the crew would catch what sleep they could before the next mission, which might be scheduled for the following morning or even later the same day if operational demands required it. The pace of ranch hand operations was intense during peak periods. Aircraft and crews were tasked with multiple missions per day when weather permitted. The operational tempo was limited primarily by aircraft availability, as battle damage and maintenance requirements often grounded significant portions of the ranch hand fleet. But when aircraft were available, the missions continued relentlessly. There was always more jungle to spray, always more target areas to defoliate, always more missions on the schedule. The ranch hand units developed their own culture and identity separate from the rest of the Air Force. They were a small, specialized community doing a unique and dangerous mission. They socialized together, drank together, shared the same gallows humor and coping mechanisms. They understood what they were doing in ways that outsiders couldn't fully grasp. The danger of the missions, the moral ambiguity of spraying chemicals over a foreign country, the physical discomfort of the work. All of this created bonds between ranch hand crew members that lasted long after their tours in Vietnam ended. But those bonds would later be tested in ways no one anticipated, because the herbicides they sprayed didn't just affect the Vietnamese jungle and the people of Vietnam. They affected the crew members themselves. The chemicals they breathed and absorbed during their missions were poisoning them, causing diseases that would emerge years or decades later. And when those diseases appeared, when ranch hand veterans started dying of cancers and other illnesses at rates far higher than expected, the bonds formed during the war would become a network of mutual support as these veterans fought new battles for recognition and compensation. But all of that was in the future. In the 1960s, ranch hand crews focused on the immediate challenges, the missions, the enemy fire, the damaged aircraft, the daily grind of a dangerous and demanding job. They flew their spray missions, delivered their toxic payloads, and returned to base to do it all again. Day after day, month after month, the herbicides kept flowing, the jungle kept dying, and the crews kept flying into the hostile sky, not knowing they were being poisoned by the very chemicals they were spraying. The ranch hand squadrons operated from several air bases in South Vietnam, with the primary base being Bien Hoa, located about 15 miles northeast of Saigon. Bien Hoa was one of the largest and busiest air bases in Southeast Asia during the war, home to multiple squadrons flying a variety of aircraft on different missions. But even in this crowded, chaotic environment, the ranch hand operations stood apart. They had their own areas on the base, their own maintenance facilities, their own storage areas for the herbicides they sprayed. The living conditions for ranch hand crews varied depending on rank and how long they had been in country. Officers lived in trailers or small buildings, typically sharing rooms with one or two other officers. Enlisted crew members lived in larger barracks buildings with rows of bunks and minimal privacy. The accommodations were Spartan by any standard, but they were luxury compared to what infantry soldiers experienced in the field. The ranch hand crews had roofs over their heads, running water, electricity most of the time, and mess halls that served hot food 3 times a day. But the comfort of the base couldn't entirely compensate for the stress and danger of the mission. Ranch hand crew members lived with the knowledge that every time they flew, there was a significant chance they would be shot at, possibly shot down, possibly killed. This constant stress permeated base life, affecting how crew members spent their time, how they socialized, how they coped with the demands of the mission. The typical daily routine for a ranch hand crew member began early. Spray missions were usually scheduled for dawn. Taking advantage of the calm morning air before thermal heating created turbulence and wind that would interfere with spray effectiveness. Crews would wake at 0400 or earlier, grab a quick breakfast, and head to the flight line for mission briefings and aircraft pre-flight. The mission briefings were held in a dedicated ranch hand operations building, a nondescript structure near the flight line that housed the intelligence and operations personnel who planned and coordinated spray missions. The briefings covered the standard information: target location, spray pattern, expected threats, weather conditions, radio frequencies, emergency procedures. Maps were displayed showing the target areas, often with overlays marking known enemy anti-aircraft positions. The intelligence officers who gave these briefings tried to provide accurate threat assessments, but the reality was that enemy anti-aircraft capabilities were fluid and unpredictable. The Viet Cong moved their weapons frequently to avoid counter-battery fire. They disguised their positions expertly. They often held their fire on the first pass or two of a spray mission, waiting until the aircraft were committed to the spray run before opening up with everything they had. So, the threat briefings were educated guesses at best, and crews learned to assume they would face ground fire on every mission, regardless of what intelligence said. After the briefing, crews would proceed to their assigned aircraft for pre-flight inspections. These inspections were thorough, more so than might be typical for a cargo mission, because the ranch hand crews knew their lives depended on their aircraft functioning properly under combat conditions. They checked control surfaces, inspected engines, tested the spray systems, verified that armor plates were properly installed, and looked for any signs of damage or wear that might become critical during a mission. The ground crews who maintained the ranch hand aircraft were unsung heroes of the operation. They worked around the clock to keep the aircraft flying despite continuous battle damage. They patched bullet holes, replaced damaged components, performed engine changes, fixed spray systems, and did whatever was necessary to get aircraft back into mission-ready status. The maintenance workload was enormous, as virtually every mission resulted in some level of battle damage that required repair. These maintainers also handled the herbicides directly, more so than the aircrews in many cases. They loaded the spray tanks before missions, they drained remaining herbicide after missions, they flushed and cleaned the spray systems, they repaired damaged spray components that were coated with dried herbicide residue. And they did all of this with minimal protective equipment, breathing the fumes, getting the chemicals on their skin, absorbing doses of herbicide and dioxin that would later cause terrible health problems. The relationships between air crews and ground crews were generally excellent. The pilots and other aircrew members understood that their survival depended on the maintenance work, and they respected the maintainers accordingly. Social barriers between officers and enlisted personnel were less rigid in ranch hand units than in some other Air Force organizations. Everyone understood they were part of the same dangerous mission, and that shared experience created camaraderie across ranks. Once the pre-flight was complete and the aircraft was loaded with herbicide, the crew would board and prepare for takeoff. The missions themselves lasted anywhere from 2 to 4 hours typically, depending on the distance to the target area, the amount of spraying required, and whether battle damage or other issues extended the flight time. During these missions, crew members experienced intense stress. The period of maximum danger, when they were flying low and slow over hostile territory actually spraying herbicide, was relatively brief, usually 10 to 15 minutes of actual spray time. But those minutes felt like hours, with every crew member tense and alert, waiting for the tracers to start coming up from the jungle. Between the spray runs, during the transit to and from the target area, crews could sometimes relax slightly. They would talk about sports, about girlfriends or wives back home, about their plans for after their tours ended, about anything except what they were actually doing. This kind of conversation was a coping mechanism, a way to maintain psychological normality in a fundamentally abnormal situation. Some crews developed elaborate running jokes or stories that would continue across multiple missions, giving them something to focus on other than the danger. After returning from a mission, crews would go through debriefing, then grab lunch if there was time before the next mission. On busy days, aircraft and crews might fly 2 or even 3 missions, with only enough time between missions for refueling, reloading with herbicide, and conducting quick inspections for any battle damage that needed immediate attention. These high-tempo days were exhausting, both physically and mentally, leaving crews drained by the evening. On days when they weren't flying, ranch hand crew members had various ways of filling their time. Physical fitness was emphasized, with base gyms and recreation facilities available. Many crew members worked out regularly, partly for general fitness and partly as a way to work off stress and aggression built up from the missions. The base had a pool where off-duty personnel could swim and relax. There were basketball courts, volleyball nets, and other sports facilities. The base exchange and commissary offered shopping opportunities, though. The selection was limited and prices were often inflated. Crew members could buy toiletries, snacks, magazines, and other small items. Care packages from home were treasured, bringing tastes of American life that weren't available at the base exchange. Families would send cookies, candy, magazines, paperback books, and personal items that made life in Vietnam slightly more bearable. The mail was a crucial connection to home. Letters would arrive irregularly, sometimes in bunches after delays in the military postal system. Crew members would eagerly read letters from wives, girlfriends, parents, friends, anyone who maintained that link to the world they had left behind. Writing letters home was a regular activity during downtime, though crew members had to be careful about what they wrote due to operational security concerns. Descriptions of missions were censored or self-censored, leaving families with limited understanding of what their loved ones were actually experiencing. The base had clubs where off-duty personnel could drink and socialize. The Officers' Club and enlisted clubs were social centers where ranch hand crews would gather in the evenings. Heavy drinking was common, a way of coping with the stress and danger of the mission. Some crew members developed drinking problems during their tours, using alcohol to numb the fear and anxiety they felt about flying missions. The military culture of the era tolerated and even encouraged heavy drinking, seeing it as normal stress relief rather than recognizing it as a warning sign of psychological trauma. Entertainment options on base were limited, but appreciated. Movies were shown regularly in base theaters, offering a few hours of escape into fictional worlds far removed from the Vietnam War. USO shows would occasionally come through, with performers ranging from B-list celebrities to major stars who voluntarily came to Vietnam to entertain the troops. These shows were major morale events, giving service members something to look forward to and talk about. Some crew members found creative outlets as coping mechanisms. They wrote poetry or journals, documenting their experiences in ways that they couldn't share in letters home. They drew or painted, capturing images of aircraft, missions, or scenes from base life. They played musical instruments, forming informal bands that would perform at club gatherings. These creative activities provided psychological relief, ways of processing the experiences they were having. Relationships with local Vietnamese civilians were complex and varied. The bases employed Vietnamese civilians in various support roles: laundry workers, cleaning staff, kitchen help, construction workers. Relationships between American service members and these Vietnamese workers ranged from friendly to purely transactional to suspicious. There was always concern about Viet Cong infiltration, about seemingly friendly workers who might be gathering intelligence or preparing sabotage. Security measures were in place to screen Vietnamese workers, but everyone knew those measures weren't perfect. Off-base activities were limited and dangerous. The surrounding areas were contested territory where American forces controlled the ground during the day, but the Viet Cong often controlled it at night. Nearby towns and cities like Saigon offered restaurants, bars, and other entertainment, but getting there and back safely was never guaranteed. Rocket and mortar attacks on American bases were common, and the roads were vulnerable to ambush. Some crew members would venture off base for what they called in-country R&R, seeking the novelty and excitement of experiencing Vietnamese cities. Others preferred to stay on base, judging that the risks of leaving weren't worth the potential benefits. The formal R&R program offered respite from Vietnam entirely. Service members were entitled to 1 week of rest and recreation leave during their tour, usually taken to locations like Hawaii, Australia, Thailand, or other destinations outside Vietnam. These R&R trips were psychological lifelines, offering a complete break from the war environment. Crew members would reunite with wives or girlfriends in Hawaii, or they would blow off steam in Bangkok or Sydney, enjoying a week of relative normalcy before returning to Vietnam and the missions. Medical care on base was generally good for routine issues and combat injuries. Base hospitals were staffed with skilled doctors and nurses who dealt with everything from minor illnesses to severe combat trauma. Ranch hand crew members who were wounded in action received immediate treatment, and the survival rate for wounded personnel was remarkably high, thanks to the quality of medical care and the speed of evacuation from aircraft to hospital. But the medical staff had no framework for recognizing or treating herbicide exposure because no one acknowledged it was a problem. Ranch hand crew members who complained of rashes, headaches, fatigue, or other symptoms that might have been related to chemical exposure were treated symptomatically. The rash was treated with cream. The headache was treated with aspirin. No one made the connection between these symptoms and the herbicides the crew members were spraying day after day. No one documented exposure levels or tracked health effects over time. The long-term health crisis that would eventually affect ranch hand veterans wasn't anticipated or prepared for. The psychological toll of ranch hand operations was significant but largely unaddressed. This was an era before PTSD was recognized as a legitimate medical condition. Mental health issues were stigmatized, seen as weakness rather than injury. So ranch hand crew members who were struggling psychologically had few resources and little support. They coped on their own or with help from their peers, developing whatever psychological defense mechanisms they could. Some crew members became fatalistic, convinced they wouldn't survive their tours and therefore adopting a live-for-today attitude. These men took excessive risks, volunteered for the most dangerous missions, and lived hard during their time off base. Some survived their tours and were surprised to make it home alive. Others' fatalism became self-fulfilling prophecy as their risk-taking caught up with them. Others developed elaborate superstitions and rituals designed to keep them safe. They would wear the same lucky item on every mission, perform the same routine before every flight, refuse to fly on certain days or with certain crew members. These superstitions were irrational, but they provided psychological comfort, a sense of control in a situation where control was largely illusory. Some crew members simply shut down emotionally, compartmentalizing the fear and stress, going through the motions of their duties without allowing themselves to feel or process what they were experiencing. This emotional numbing was protective in the short term, allowing them to function in an incredibly stressful environment. But it often caused problems later, as suppressed emotions and trauma would surface after they returned home, sometimes years after their service ended. The bonds between ranch hand crew members were intense and complex. They were brothers in arms, bonded by shared danger and shared experience. They trusted each other with their lives on every mission. But there was also competition, resentment, and conflict, as in any military unit. Some crew members clashed over personality conflicts or differences in how they approached the mission. Some felt others weren't pulling their weight or were taking unnecessary risks. These tensions were usually managed and didn't interfere with mission effectiveness, but they added another layer of stress to an already stressful situation. The rotation schedule meant that crew members were constantly arriving and departing. New replacements would arrive to fill slots left by crew members who had completed their tours or who had been killed or wounded. The new arrivals were often nervous and inexperienced, while the veterans who had been flying missions for months were jaded and worn down. The contrast was stark, and it sometimes led to tensions between the inexperienced newcomers eager to prove themselves and the tired veterans just trying to survive until their rotation dates. Ranch hand crew members kept track of their mission counts and days remaining in their tours with the obsessive attention that combat soldiers have always given to such matters. They marked calendars, counted missions, calculated how many more times they would have to fly into hostile fire before they could go home. Short-timer syndrome affected those nearing the end of their tours, making them even more cautious and nervous as they got closer to going home. The cruel irony was that some crew members were killed or wounded on their final missions, falling victim to the danger just days or weeks before they would have rotated out. The base itself was not entirely safe. Rocket and mortar attacks by Viet Cong forces were regular occurrences. These attacks usually happened at night, with warning sirens sending everyone scrambling for bunkers as enemy rockets impacted around the base. The attacks rarely caused major damage or casualties, but they ensured that even on days when they weren't flying, ranch hand crew members couldn't completely relax. The war could reach them even on the ground. The living conditions, the stress, the danger, the separation from home, all of it wore on ranch hand crew members over the course of their tours. Most served 12-month tours, though the exact length varied depending on individual circumstances and service branch. 12 months might not seem like a long time, but in the intense environment of ranch hand operations, it felt like an eternity. Every day, every mission, every close call with enemy fire added to the cumulative psychological burden. By the time crew members completed their tours and rotated home, they were changed men. Some of the changes were visible: weight loss from the stress and the climate, premature aging from the harsh conditions, injuries from combat. Other changes were invisible: psychological trauma, developing health problems from chemical exposure, altered perspectives on life and death and what mattered. They returned to the United States, to families and communities that had little understanding of what they had experienced, carrying burdens they didn't know how to talk about or process. But before we can understand what happened to ranch hand veterans after they came home, we need to understand more about the missions themselves, about the scope and scale of the defoliation campaign, and about how the operation evolved over the years it was conducted. Because Ranch Hand was more than just a collection of dangerous spray missions. It was a massive chemical warfare campaign that sprayed millions of gallons of herbicides over Vietnam, affecting millions of people and fundamentally altering the landscape of the country. Operation Ranch Hand was not a small-scale tactical program. It was a massive strategic campaign that transformed the landscape of South Vietnam and parts of neighboring countries. Between 1962 and 1971, Ranch Hand aircraft sprayed approximately 20 million gallons of herbicides over an area of approximately 4.5 million acres. To put that in perspective, 4.5 million acres is roughly 7,000 square miles, an area about the size of the state of New Jersey, completely sprayed with toxic chemicals. The scale of this operation was unprecedented in human history. Never before had chemical herbicides been used on such a massive scale for military purposes. The only comparable programs were agricultural operations, but even large-scale agricultural. Spraying covered far less area with far less intensive application rates than Ranch Hand. Vietnam became the site of the largest chemical warfare campaign ever conducted. The targets for Ranch Hand missions fell into several categories, each with different tactical objectives. The largest category by area was jungle defoliation, the spraying of dense forest areas to remove canopy cover. The military identified key areas where the Viet Cong were believed to operate and systematically sprayed those areas to strip away the protective jungle. These defoliation missions aimed to expose enemy base camps, supply routes, and staging areas to aerial observation and attack. The results of jungle defoliation were dramatic. Within days of spraying, the leaves on trees would begin to wither and turn brown. Within weeks, defoliated trees would drop their leaves, turning lush green jungle into a skeleton forest of bare branches. The exposed ground beneath could then be seen from aircraft, revealing trails, structures, and other signs of enemy activity that had been invisible before spraying. But the defoliation was never as complete or as lasting as planners hoped. Not all tree species were equally susceptible to the herbicides. Bamboo and certain hardwoods were more resistant and would survive spraying or recover quickly. The bare forest floor would rapidly be colonized by fast-growing grasses and shrubs, creating new ground cover that, while different from the original jungle, still provided some concealment. And the trees themselves would often re-sprout from their roots, gradually recovering if not sprayed again. Areas that were sprayed once would show effects for months to a few years. Areas that were sprayed multiple times suffered more lasting damage, with some heavily sprayed areas becoming essentially biological deserts where nothing would grow for years. The second major category of Ranch Hand targets was communication routes. Roads, trails, rivers, and canals were sprayed along their lengths to create cleared corridors where ambushes would be more difficult. The idea was that if vegetation was removed for 100 meters or more on each side of a road, the Viet Cong couldn't hide near the road waiting to ambush convoys. Similarly, cleared zones along waterways would make it harder to ambush boats or plant mines along riverbanks. These communication route clearance missions were tactically valuable but required constant re-spraying. The tropical climate and fertile soil meant that vegetation would regrow quickly if not continuously suppressed. Some key routes were sprayed monthly, or even more frequently, receiving massive total herbicide doses over the years of the program. These repeatedly sprayed areas suffered the most severe environmental damage, with soil contamination and ecological destruction that persisted for decades. The third category of targets was crop destruction. The military identified areas where the Viet Cong were believed to be growing food crops, particularly rice, and sprayed those areas to destroy the crops and deny food to enemy forces. These missions used Agent Blue, a herbicide specifically designed to desiccate plants quickly, causing rice and other crops to dry up and die within days. The crop destruction missions were among the most controversial aspects of ranch hand operations. Even at the time, critics argued that the missions harmed innocent civilians more than they harmed the Viet Cong. The targeted areas were often in regions with mixed loyalties where some farmers supported the Viet Cong, while others were neutral or supported the South Vietnamese government. Spraying destroyed crops indiscriminately, harming everyone in the area regardless of their political affiliations. The military defended crop destruction missions by arguing that food grown in Viet Cong-controlled areas would inevitably feed enemy forces, and that denying food to the enemy was a legitimate military objective. But the humanitarian consequences were severe. Crop destruction contributed to food shortages and famine conditions in some regions. Farmers who lost their crops to spraying faced starvation or were forced to relocate, often to already overcrowded cities where they became refugees. The human cost of crop destruction was high, and whether it achieved meaningful military objectives remains debated. The evolution of ranch hand operations over the years reflected changing military priorities and growing sophistication in defoliation tactics. The early missions in 1962 and 63 were relatively small-scale, experimental in nature, as crews and planners learned how to effectively employ herbicides in a combat environment. Aircraft flew relatively cautious missions. Spray patterns were inefficient, and the overall area covered was limited. By 1964 and 65, ranch hand had scaled up significantly. More aircraft were dedicated to the mission. Crews had gained experience, and the military had committed to defoliation as a major element of strategy. The target areas expanded to include larger swaths of jungle and longer stretches of communication routes. The total gallons of herbicide sprayed per year increased dramatically from about 300,000 gallons in 1962 to over 4 million gallons in 1966. The peak years of ranch hand operations were 1967 through 1969. During these years, the program was operating at maximum capacity, with multiple squadrons flying constant missions. The quantities of herbicide sprayed were enormous, with 1967 seeing over 4.8 million gallons sprayed, and 1968 seeing over 5 million gallons. These were the years when Riley and his fellow crews were flying multiple missions per day, when the spray missions were relentless, when the environmental and human impact of the program was at its peak. The tactics and procedures evolved as well. Early missions often involved single aircraft operating independently. By the mid-1960s, missions frequently involved multiple aircraft flying in formation, allowing larger areas to be covered in single missions. The formations also provided mutual support, with aircraft able to cover each other during spray runs and help if one aircraft was damaged by ground fire. The Viet Cong response to ranch hand operations also evolved. Initially, enemy forces were often surprised by spray missions, and their anti-aircraft response was limited and disorganized. But as the Viet Cong came to understand the defoliation program, they adapted their tactics. They learned to recognize the distinctive ranch hand aircraft and prioritize them as targets. They positioned anti-aircraft weapons along likely spray routes. They studied ranch hand patterns and anticipated where missions would occur. The result was that ranch hand missions became progressively more dangerous over the years as the enemy learned how to more effectively engage the spray aircraft. By 1968 and 69, ranch hand crews were facing intense, organized ground fire on almost every mission. The casualty rates increased, both in terms of aircraft damaged and crew members killed or wounded. Some missions had to be aborted due to overwhelming ground fire. Other missions were completed despite severe battle damage that left aircraft barely able to return to base. The courage required to continue flying ranch hand missions in this increasingly deadly environment was extraordinary. The defoliation campaign's environmental impact became increasingly apparent as the years went by. Large areas of South Vietnam were being transformed from jungle to wasteland. The mangrove forests along the coast, which were particularly targeted because they provided cover for Viet Cong operations, were devastated by spraying. Mangroves are slow-growing and extremely sensitive to herbicides, and the sprayed mangrove areas remain barren for decades after the war ended. Some still haven't recovered. The inland forests showed different patterns of damage. Areas sprayed once would recover over a period of years, with new growth gradually replacing the defoliated vegetation. Areas sprayed multiple times suffered more lasting damage. The repeated herbicide applications killed the trees and contaminated the soil, to the point where natural recovery was extremely slow. Some areas that were sprayed heavily during ranch hand are still ecologically damaged more than 50 years later, with soils that are less fertile and forests that are less diverse than they were before spraying. The impact on wildlife was severe, but poorly documented at the time. Birds, mammals, insects, and other animals lost their habitats as the jungle was defoliated. Food chains were disrupted as plants died, and the insects and animals that depended on them disappeared. Fish and aquatic and life in rivers and streams were affected by herbicide runoff. The full ecological consequences of ranch hand will never be fully known because baseline studies of Vietnamese ecosystems before spraying were limited. But the impact was clearly severe and long-lasting. The impact on human populations was immediate and severe. Vietnamese civilians living in or near sprayed areas were exposed to herbicides through multiple routes. Direct spray exposure occurred when missions drifted over villages or when villages were deliberately targeted as part of crop destruction operations. Water supply contamination occurred when herbicides entered wells, streams, and rivers. Food contamination occurred through sprayed crops and livestock. The dioxin contamination in Agent Orange accumulated in the food chain, becoming concentrated in fish, meat, and other animal products. The health effects on Vietnamese civilians from herbicide exposure have been devastating and long-lasting. Rates of cancer, birth defects, and other health problems are significantly elevated in areas that were heavily sprayed. Multiple generations have been affected, as dioxin exposure can cause genetic damage that affects children and grandchildren of exposed individuals. The Vietnamese government estimates that several million Vietnamese have suffered health problems related to Agent Orange and other herbicides, though exact numbers are difficult to determine and remain disputed. By 1969, growing concerns about the environmental and health impacts of herbicide spraying were beginning to affect policy. Scientific studies were raising questions about the safety of the herbicides being used, particularly the dioxin contamination in Agent Orange. Military effectiveness was also being questioned, as it became clear that defoliation was not achieving decisive strategic results. The Viet Cong continued to operate effectively despite the massive defoliation campaign. In 1970, the use of Agent Orange was restricted following studies showing potential health risks. In 1971, Operation Ranch Hand officially ended, though some limited herbicide spraying continued under other program names through the end of American involvement in Vietnam. The massive chemical warfare campaign that had transformed the landscape of Vietnam was over, but its consequences would persist for decades. The ranch hand crews who flew the missions that sprayed those 20 million gallons of herbicides had no say in the policy decisions that created the program or the decisions that ended it. They were military personnel following orders, conducting missions assigned by their commanders. Most believed at the time that what they were doing was necessary and justified by military necessity. The official position was that the herbicides were safe and the missions were important for denying the enemy cover and reducing American casualties. But some crew members had doubts even during the operation. They could see the devastation they were causing. They flew over villages and saw civilians affected by the spray. They saw the vast areas of dead forest, the brown and barren zones where green jungle had once stood. They wondered whether this level of environmental destruction could be justified, whether the tactical benefits were worth the costs. Most kept these doubts to themselves, not wanting to question orders or seem disloyal, but the doubts were there. And some crew members were experiencing health problems even before their tours ended. Rashes, respiratory problems, headaches, fatigue, and other symptoms that might have been related to herbicide exposure. These symptoms were generally attributed to the harsh conditions in Vietnam, to stress, to tropical diseases, to anything except the herbicides. Because admitting the herbicides were dangerous would mean admitting that the crew members were being poisoned by their own missions. and that was unthinkable to military leadership. The ranch hand crews completed their tours and rotated home, most of them between 1965 and 1971, as the operation ramped up and then wound down. They returned to the United States, received their discharge papers or transferred to other assignments, and tried to resume normal lives. Most tried to put their Vietnam experiences behind them and move forward. They got jobs, started families, bought houses, pursued the American dream, but the herbicides they had sprayed and been exposed to came home with them, hidden in their bodies, accumulated in their tissues, slowly causing damage that wouldn't become apparent for years. The dioxin in Agent Orange is persistent and bioaccumulative. It doesn't break down quickly in the human body. It concentrates in fatty tissues and organs, and it slowly damages cells and DNA, causing cancers and other diseases that take years or decades to develop. The ranch hand veterans didn't know they were poisoned. They had been told the herbicides were safe. When health problems began appearing, they initially didn't connect them to their service in Vietnam. A rash here, a bout of fatigue there, these seemed like normal health issues, not symptoms of toxic chemical exposure. It would take years before the pattern became clear, before ranch hand veterans realized they were dying at abnormal rates from diseases caused by the herbicides they had sprayed. The first indications that something was seriously wrong with ranch hand veterans came in the mid to late 1970s, roughly 5 to 10 years after most crew members had completed their tours. Veterans were experiencing health problems at rates that seemed higher than normal. Cancers, particularly soft tissue sarcomas and lymphomas, skin conditions, especially chlorachin, a severe skin disease associated with dioxin exposure, neurological problems, liver disease, and perhaps most heartbreaking, their children were being born with severe birth defects at rates far above the general population. Initially, individual veterans experiencing these problems didn't realize there was a pattern. A former ranch hand pilot would develop cancer and assume it was bad luck. A spray operator would have a child with birth defects and blame random chance. These men didn't know that their fellow ranch hand veterans were experiencing similar problems. The military had not maintained systematic health tracking of ranch hand veterans after they left service, so no one was collecting data that might have revealed the pattern earlier. The pattern began to emerge through informal networks of veterans. Former crew members who stayed in touch would learn about each other's health problems. At reunions or through correspondence, they began comparing notes. Someone would mention they had developed lymphoma. Someone else would say they had lymphoma too. A third person would mention their child had been born with spina bifida. Others would reveal similar stories. The coincidences began to seem like more than just coincidence. By the late 1970s, some ranch hand veterans were convinced they had been poisoned by Agent Orange and the other herbicides they had sprayed. They began trying to get help from the Veterans Administration, filing disability claims, requesting medical treatment, seeking recognition that their health problems were service-connected. They were largely rebuffed. The VA's official position was that there was insufficient evidence linking herbicide exposure to the health problems the veterans were reporting. Claims were denied, benefits were refused. The veterans were told they couldn't prove their illnesses were caused by Agent Orange. The veterans' frustration grew. They knew what they had been exposed to. They had breathed the herbicides, had gotten them on their skin, had flown through clouds of spray mission after mission. They could see that fellow ranch hand veterans were getting sick and dying at alarming rates. But the government that had sent them to spray herbicides was now denying that those herbicides had harmed them. Some veterans began organizing to fight for recognition and compensation. They formed advocacy groups, contacted media, and lobbied politicians. They shared their stories publicly, describing their health problems and arguing that Agent Orange had poisoned them. Some of these early advocates died of their illnesses while still fighting for recognition, their deaths serving as tragic proof of the very harm they were trying to get acknowledged. The scientific evidence was slowly building. Independent researchers began studying the health effects of dioxin exposure. Studies of industrial accidents where workers were exposed to dioxin showed elevated rates of cancer and other diseases. Animal studies demonstrated that dioxin caused birth defects and cancer in laboratory animals at very low doses. The biological mechanisms by which dioxin damages cells and DNA were being elucidated. But the chemical companies that had manufactured Agent Orange, particularly Dow Chemical and Monsanto, resisted the growing evidence. They funded their own studies that claimed herbicides were safe. They argued that any health problems in veterans were due to other causes. They lobbied against government recognition of Agent Orange health effects. The companies faced potential liability for billions of dollars in damages if it was officially recognized that their products had poisoned American veterans and Vietnamese civilians. The military and government were also resistant to acknowledging the problem. Admitting that Agent Orange had harmed American veterans would mean admitting that the military had poisoned its own personnel. It would raise uncomfortable questions about why more wasn't done to protect crew members from exposure. It would create enormous financial liability for veterans' benefits and medical care. And it would validate criticisms of the Ranch Hand program and the broader American conduct of the war in Vietnam. The breakthrough came in 1979, when a group of veterans filed a class action lawsuit against the chemical companies that had manufactured Agent Orange. The lawsuit, known as the Agent Orange Product Liability Litigation, alleged that the companies had produced a defective product containing dangerous dioxin contamination and had failed to warn about the health risks. The lawsuit sought damages for the thousands of veterans who had been exposed to Agent Orange and who were experiencing health problems as a result. The class action included not just Ranch Hand crew members, but all veterans who had served in Vietnam and been exposed to Agent Orange, which potentially meant millions of veterans. Ranch Hand crews were among the most heavily exposed, but infantry soldiers who had walked through sprayed jungles, base personnel who had worked near herbicide storage areas, and many others had also been exposed to varying degrees. The lawsuit proceeded through the courts for several years, with the chemical companies fighting aggressively to avoid liability. But the evidence was mounting. Health studies were increasingly showing correlations between Agent Orange exposure and various diseases. The number of sick veterans continued to grow. Public sympathy was increasingly with the veterans rather than the companies. In 1984, just before the case was scheduled to go to trial, the chemical companies agreed to a settlement. They would pay $180 million into a settlement fund that would be distributed to affected veterans and their families. While this sounds like a large sum divided among the thousands of claimants, individual payments were often quite small, just a few $1,000s in many cases. Many veterans felt the settlement was inadequate given the harm they had suffered, but it represented at least some acknowledgement of responsibility and some compensation. More importantly, the settlement and the publicity around the lawsuit had forced the issue into public consciousness. The media covered the Agent Orange story extensively. The public became aware that American veterans had been poisoned by chemicals their own military had ordered them to spray. Political pressure built for the government to do more to help affected veterans. In 1984, Congress passed legislation requiring the VA to provide medical care for certain health conditions presumed to be related to Agent Orange exposure. The list of presumptive conditions was initially short, including only chlorachin, soft tissue sarcomas, and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. But it was a start, the first official government acknowledgement that Agent Orange had harmed American veterans. Over subsequent years, additional conditions were added to the presumptive list as more scientific evidence accumulated. Eventually, the list included numerous cancers, type 2, diabetes, ischemic heart disease, Parkinson's disease, peripheral neuropathy, and several other conditions. Veterans with these conditions who could demonstrate they had served in Vietnam and been exposed to Agent Orange became eligible for disability compensation and medical care through the VA. For Ranch Hand veterans specifically, the situation was somewhat different. In 1982, the Air Force had begun a health study specifically focused on Ranch Hand veterans. The Air Force Ranch Hand study was designed to track the health of former Ranch Hand crew members and compare them to similar veterans who had not been exposed to herbicides. The study would eventually follow participants for decades, becoming one of the longest-running health studies in military history. The Ranch Hand study produced important scientific findings. It documented elevated rates of diabetes in Ranch Hand veterans. It found increased rates of some cancers, though the statistical significance varied depending on which diseases and which time periods were examined. It found evidence of psychological effects, including increased rates of PTSD. And critically, it documented dioxin levels in Ranch Hand veterans that were significantly higher than in the comparison group, providing objective proof that ranch hand crews had indeed been heavily exposed to dioxin. These findings were important for individual ranch hand veterans seeking VA benefits. Being part of the ranch hand study and having documented high dioxin levels made it easier to prove exposure and get disability claims approved. Many ranch hand veterans credit the study with helping them finally receive the benefits and medical care they needed. But the ranch hand study was also controversial. Some veterans and advocates argued that the study design was flawed, that it minimized health effects, and that it took too long to produce findings. The Air Force was effectively studying whether its own program had poisoned its own personnel, creating a potential conflict of interest. Some findings seemed to downplay health effects that veterans were clearly experiencing. The study became a point of contention in the broader debate about Agent Orange. The health consequences for ranch hand veterans have been severe and long-lasting. The men who flew spray missions in the 1960s began dying prematurely in the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s. Cancer rates have been significantly elevated compared to the general population. Many ranch hand veterans have suffered from multiple health conditions simultaneously, and their bodies ravaged by decades of toxic chemical exposure. Captain James Riley, who flew the mission described at the beginning of this story, developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in 1986, 20 years after his spray missions over Ku Chai. He fought the disease for 3 years before dying in 1989 at age 47. His widow believed his lymphoma was caused by Agent Orange exposure during his ranch hand service, and the VA eventually agreed, granting her survivor benefits. First Lieutenant Michael Chen, Riley's co-pilot who was wounded during that mission, survived his gunshot wound and returned to the United States after completing his tour. He developed type 2 diabetes in his 40s, earlier than would be expected, given his family history and lifestyle. He also developed peripheral neuropathy in his legs, losing feeling in his feet and experiencing chronic pain. Both conditions are now recognized as presumptively related to Agent Orange exposure. Chen received VA disability compensation, but no amount of money could restore his health or give him back the years of suffering. Technical Sergeant Robert Martinez, the flight engineer, developed soft tissue sarcoma in 1993. He underwent surgery, radiation, and chemotherapy, but the cancer spread. He died in 1995, leaving behind a wife and 3 children. His family received VA survivor benefits, but they lost a husband and father far too soon. Staff Sergeant William Thompson, the spray operator who stood in the cargo area directly above the herbicide tanks on every mission, may have received the heaviest exposures of any crew position. He developed chlorasin, a severe disfiguring skin condition caused by dioxin while still in Vietnam. After returning home, he developed liver disease, respiratory problems, and eventually prostate cancer. He became an advocate for ranch hand veterans, testifying before Congress and speaking to media about the health effects of Agent Orange. He died in 2007 at age 65. The stories of these 4 men are representative of what happened to many ranch hand crews. Out of every 4-man crew that flew spray missions, typically at least 2 would develop serious health problems attributable to Agent Orange exposure. Some crews lost 3 or even all 4 members to Agent Orange-related diseases. The casualty rate from chemical exposure ultimately exceeded the casualty rate from combat, though the chemical casualties took decades to appear. The children of ranch hand veterans have also suffered. Birth defects, including spina bifida, cleft palate, heart defects, and others have appeared at elevated rates in the children and even grandchildren of exposed veterans. Dioxin can cause genetic damage that affects future generations. Some ranch hand veterans have multiple children with birth defects. The grief and guilt these veterans feel, knowing their exposure to herbicides may have harmed their children, is a heavy psychological burden added to their own health problems. The Vietnamese victims of Agent Orange have suffered even more severely and with even less support. Millions of Vietnamese civilians were exposed to herbicides, many at very high doses from direct spraying or from living in heavily contaminated areas. The health effects have been devastating. Cancer rates in sprayed areas are significantly elevated. Birth defects are common in areas that were heavily sprayed, with some villages reporting that more than 10% of children are born with serious birth defects. The Vietnamese government has provided some support to Agent Orange victims, but resources are limited, and millions remain without adequate medical care or compensation. The United States government has provided some humanitarian assistance for Agent Orange remediation and health care in Vietnam, but has not accepted legal liability for the herbicide spraying. The chemical companies have paid nothing to Vietnamese victims. The vast majority of suffering has gone uncompensated. The environmental cleanup of Agent Orange contamination in Vietnam continues today, more than 50 years after the spraying ended. Several former American military bases where herbicides were stored and loaded onto aircraft remain heavily contaminated with dioxin. The soil is so contaminated that plants can't grow, and people can't safely live in the areas. Cleanup involves excavating and treating the contaminated soil, a process that is expensive and time-consuming. Several bases have been cleaned up with American funding, but others remain contaminated. For the ranch hand veterans who survived into the 2000s and 2010s, old age has brought new challenges. Many are dealing with multiple health conditions simultaneously. Some are in their 70s and 80s, coping with both age-related health issues and Agent Orange-related diseases. The VA continues to provide medical care and disability compensation, though many veterans feel the support is inadequate given what they sacrificed and suffered. The ranch hand veterans have been among the most vocal advocates for Agent Orange recognition and support. They formed veterans organizations specifically for ranch hand crews. They attended VA meetings and congressional hearings. They spoke to media and wrote books documenting their experiences and health problems. Their advocacy has helped not just themselves, but all Agent Orange-affected veterans by keeping the issue in public consciousness and pushing for better benefits and medical care. The legacy of Operation Ranch Hand is complex and contested. From a military perspective, the operation achieved some of its tactical objectives. Jungle areas were defoliated, roots were cleared, and the Viet Cong were denied some of the cover and concealment they had previously enjoyed. But the strategic impact was limited. The defoliation did not prevent the Viet Cong from continuing to operate effectively, and it did not change the ultimate outcome of the war. From a humanitarian and environmental perspective, Ranch Hand was a disaster. Millions of gallons of toxic herbicides were sprayed over a country, causing environmental damage that persists decades later. Millions of people, both Vietnamese civilians and American service members, were exposed to dangerous chemicals. Thousands have died, and thousands more have suffered serious health problems as a result. The human cost of the operation far exceeded any military benefit achieved. From a legal and ethical perspective, Ranch Hand raises difficult questions that remain debated. Was it ethical to spray toxic chemicals over a foreign country, knowing that civilians would be exposed? Was it legal under international law, or did it constitute a form of chemical warfare prohibited by treaties? Should the United States government and the chemical companies that manufactured Agent Orange bear greater responsibility for the harm caused? These questions have no easy answers, but they deserve continued examination. For the men who flew the missions, the Ranch Hand experience was a defining part of their lives. They served their country, faced danger with courage, and completed difficult missions under extreme conditions. They deserve recognition and honor for their service. But they also deserve acknowledgement that they were harmed by that service, that the chemicals they sprayed poisoned them, and that they have paid a terrible price for following orders they believed were necessary and justified. The story of the Ranch Hand defoliation crews is ultimately a cautionary tale about the unintended consequences of war and about the costs that soldiers pay long after the shooting stops. The C-123 providers that flew spray missions over Vietnam have long since been retired and scrapped. The herbicide stocks have been destroyed. The program has ended and become history, but the consequences continue. Ranch Hand veterans are still dying of Agent Orange-related diseases. Vietnamese victims are still being born with birth defects. The contaminated sites in Vietnam are still being cleaned up. The legacy persists. The crews who flew those C-123 providers, who sprayed those millions of gallons of herbicides, who faced enemy fire and completed their dangerous missions, deserve to be remembered, not just as statistics or casualties, but as real people who served and sacrificed. They were pilots, navigators, flight engineers, and spray operators. They were fathers and sons, husbands and brothers. They did what their country asked of them, and they paid a price far greater than they knew when they volunteered for those missions. The ranch hand motto, "Only we can prevent forests," was meant as dark humor, but it took on a more tragic meaning as the years passed and the health consequences became clear. The crews prevented forests, yes, by destroying them with herbicides, but they couldn't prevent the consequences of those herbicides. They couldn't prevent the dioxin from poisoning them. They couldn't prevent the cancers and birth defects and years of suffering. Today, decades after the last ranch hand mission, only a handful of the original crews remain alive. They are elderly men now, survivors who outlived many of their fellow crew members. They carry their memories and their scars, both visible and invisible. They remember the missions, the danger, the camaraderie, and the terrifying moments when enemy fire tore through their aircraft. They remember the smell of the herbicides and the sight of the defoliated jungle and the knowledge that they were part of something unprecedented and controversial. And they remember their friends who didn't survive, either shot down over Vietnam or killed decades later by the herbicides they sprayed. They honor those memories by continuing to tell the story, by ensuring that the ranch hand experience is not forgotten, and by fighting to ensure that future generations of military personnel are better protected from toxic exposures. The story of the ranch hand defoliation crews is a story of courage and sacrifice, of duty and service, of unintended consequences and delayed costs. It's a story that deserves to be told and remembered, not just as military history, but as a human story about the price of war and the obligation that governments have to those who serve. The men who flew the C-123 providers earned their place in history, and their story, in all its complexity and tragedy, must not be forgotten.